हैं हम सताए हुए। अरे वो रो के बोली फलक के हैं हम सताए हुए। नजर झुकाए हुए आस्तीं चढ़ाए हुए। सलवात भेजिएगा मोहम्मद व आले मोहम्मद पर। सलाम की चरण अशार पेश खदमत है बारगाह इमाम मौला सजाद सलाम में। एक बार फिर दुरूद भेजिएगा मोहम्मद वाले मोहम्मद। मुझे रई पैदा हुआ था सम हसन के वास्ते। मुझे रई पैदा हुआ था सम हसन के वास्ते। और बना खंजर शहे तशना दहन के वास्ते। मुझे रई पैदा हुआ। ए फलक इंसाफ से तजवीज़ तेरी दूर है। अरे ए फलक इंसाफ से तजवीज़ तेरी दूर है। अरे क्यों हो गर्दन सजाद तौक़ो रसन के वास्ते। मुझे रई पैदा हुआ। बोले आबिद अकबरो असगर तो हो शह पर निसार। बोले आबिद अकबरो असगर तो हो शह पर निसार। और हम जीते रहे रंजो में हन के वास्ते। मुझे रई पैदा। बोली ज़ैनब शेम्र से छीन मत मेरी रिदा। बोली ज़ैनब शेम्र से छीन मत मेरी रिदा। अरे ये रिदा रहने दे भाई के कफन के वास्ते। मुझे रई पैदा हुआ था। सलवात भेजिएगा मोहम्मद वाले मोहम्मद में। सूरह फातिहा। बारे दिगर नाराए सलावत। जब आबिद को बेकस को में अजलाया, जब आबिद बेकस को में अजलाया, दुनिया दगाबाज की नियत में बलाया, वो जहर दिया जिससे सुकून में खलल आया, मानिंदे हसन कट के कले जाने कल, मानिंदे हसन कट के कले जाने कला, जालिम ने मरीज़े शहे दिलगीर को मारा, शब्बर की तरह दिलबर शबीर को मार, शब्बर की तरह दिलबर शबीर को मार, औलादे पैगंबर पे मुसीबत का ये दिन है, प्यासे के आज़ादारों की रहलत का ये दिन, मजलूम के दिल भर की शहादत का ये दिन, आशूरे के बाद और मुसीबत का ये दिन, आशूरे के बाद और मुसीबत का ये है, इस गम से जिगरे चाक है ज़हराओ नबी का, उठता है अज़ादार हुसैन इब्ने अली का, उठता है अज़ादार हुसैन इब्ने अली का, वो ज़हर से दमे आबिद बेकस का उखड़ना, सज्जादे दिल अफ़गार का बाकर से बिछड़, बिगड़ी हुई तक़दीर गरीबों की बिगड़ना, उजड़ा हुआ घर फातिमा ज़हरा का उजड़, उजड़ा हुआ घर फातिमा ज़हरा का उजड़ना, वीरा हुआ और हाय वली इब्ने वली का, बुझता है चराग़ आज हुसैन इब्ने अली, वीरा हुआ दरबार वली इब्ने वली का, बुझता है चराग़ आज हुसैन इब्ने अली का, जब आबिद बेकस को बयां में अजलाया। सलावत भेजिएगा मोहम्मद वाले मोहम्मद में।
बावजूद नारे सरवत मोमिनीन, कल यहाँ पर 4 बजे एक मजलिस है जनाब अबुल भाई अबुल हसन जैदी साहब की जानिब से। आप लोगों से गुजारिश है कि 4 बजे उस मजलिस में तशरीफ़ लाइए, और मजलिस के बाद इमाम ज़ैनुल आबिदीन अलैहिस्सलाम का ताबूत भी निकलेगा, और इस मजलिस को जनाब अम्मार हैदर साहब जो हैं वो खिताब फरमाएंगे। ये मजलिस ठीक 4 बजे शुरू होगी कल। Tomorrow night there is a question and answer session after Maulana Muhammad Abbas Panju's speech, and men and women both sides will participate in this session. So I will humbly request lady side, please, if you have some questions, so send us before so we can arrange all those questions. And now I will request Maulana, please come and side Maulana.
Before we call Sheikh, a brief introduction about the Sheikh. A loud salawat, please. Muhammad Abbas Panju Maulana Sahab was born in Kenya, and in the initial days he had his studies from Syria, and later on he moved to Canada for his higher studies, and he had his interest in banking and finance, and he was working there for about 2 years in Canada, and later on he was in UK, and in 2 centers he was a resident alim, and after that, in about 4 to 5 years later on, he moved again to Hawza, Najaf, because of the issues that they had in Syria. The Sheikh was moved to Syria, from Syria to Najaf, and he pursued his studies. His major studies were fiqh, akhlaq, and with this, I would like to request the Sheikh to please address the Mu'mineen and Mu'minat. A loud salawat, please.
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله بارئ الخلائق الأجمعين، باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء، حبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا، أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. ثم الصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، لا سيما ولي الله الحجة ابن الحسن صاحب الأمر والزمان. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرح روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم وعلى منكري فضائلهم وعلى غاصبي حقوقهم من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين. آمين رب العالمين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرج. صلى الله عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، صلى الله عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة. غريب الغرباء يا مظلوم كربلاء السلام على من جعل الله الشفاء في تربته السلام على من الإجابة تحت قبته السلام على ساكن كربلاء فيا ليتنا ثم يا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي يا سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما أما بعد قال مولانا إمام علي بن الحسين زين العابدين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجه ما في مكة ومدينة 20 رجلا يحبنا أهل البيت صدق الإمام وآمنا به نوروا مجالسكم بذكر محمد وآل محمد أحبائي, the period of the imamat of Maulana Imam Ali Sajjad Ruhi Lahul Fida is perhaps one of the most darkest times of Islamic history. And you find over here that once Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam returned back to Medina from Kufa, the Imam gives us an idea of how dark this period in Islamic history was, where Imam Sajjad alayhi salam says, and this hadith sharif is narrated by Alama al-Majlis in Biharul Anwar, Mawla Sajjad Ruhi Lahul Fida says, there isn't in this entire Makkah and Medina, ما في مكة ومدينة 20 رجلا يحبنا أهل البيت. In this entire area of Hijaz, between Mecca and Medina, Imam Sajjad says, there isn't 20 people who love us Ahlul Bayt. In the entire Hijaz, you could not find 20 people who love Ahlul Bayt. And look at the words of Imam Sajjad Ruhi Lahul Fida. His words are very accurate. He said, ما في مكة ومدينة 20 رجلا يحبنا محب. He said, lover of Ahlul Bayt. He didn't say Shia. He didn't say follower. He didn't say there aren't 20 Shia, there aren't 20 followers. The Shia is of the highest level. You have Shia, and then you have Muttabi', those who are on Ittiba', and then you have Muhib. Even at that lowest level, Muhib, somebody to sympathize with Imam al-Sajjad and with Ahlul Bayt. In the entire Hijaz, they could not find 20 people. In these circumstances, Imam Sajjad begins his role of imamat. And it is important for us to understand the circumstances in which Imam Zainul Abidin lived, so that we can fully understand and appreciate the impact of the role that he played when it came to reviving Shiaism and giving birth to Tashayyu again from new. And you find that this period of Islamic history where there weren't even 20 people who loved Ahlul Bayt, this period within the Islamic community was very similar to the state of the Islamic community after the martyrdom of Rasulullah. You find in the book Al-Ikhtisas of Shaykh al-Mufid, rahmatullah alayh, Hadith al-Sharif narrated by Maulana Imam Abu Ja'far Muhammad al-Baqir salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil faraja. Ma'soom Imam says, irtadda ba'da nabi al-kull. ارتد الناس بعد النبي إلا ثلاثة مقداد والسلمان وأبو ذر. Similar situation. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam says to us, after the martyrdom of Rasulullah, irtad, people, the Islamic community became apostates and left Islam except 3 people. Miqdad, Salman, and Abu Dhar. The Imam then says, slowly by slowly, people started returning back to the fold of Islam. Either you come and you see the fitna and the intensity of the fitna after the martyrdom of Rasulullah. Person should not say, oh, this is a hadith, how we can believe in such a hadith. All these sahabis, all these people who lived with Rasulullah, all of them went astray, all of them abandoned the religion except 3. How can this be possible? You find these words of the Imam is actually a tafsir of the Quran itself. If you go back to Surah Ali Imran, verse 144, this verse was revealed on the occasion of the Battle of Uhud, when the companions and the Sahaba fled from the battlefield. Shuf, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. And Muhammad and Rasul, the Holy Prophet, Muhammad is nothing except a messenger. قَدْ مَضَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ. And there are many prophets who came before him and also went before him. أَفَإِنْ مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلْ إِنْ قَلَبْتُمْ عَلَىٰ أَعْقَابِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed this ayah for the Muslims until the day of judgment, where he says to them that Rasulullah, like previous prophets before him, came and went. If Rasulullah dies or is killed, will you then turn back upon your feet? إِنْ قَلَبْتُمْ عَلَىٰ أَعْقَابِكُمْ. Those of us who are familiar with Arabic language, in qalabtum, the dhamir over here, in qalabtum, over here is plural tense, addressing all of the Sahaba, Ansar and Muhajirin without exception. The nukta kullish latifa, بين القوسين. We have to read the Quran with tadabbur and tafakkur. Kalima of the Quran needs to be understood. Look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. Afa in mata aw qutil. If the Prophet was to die, rather if the Prophet was killed, will you then turn back on your feet? This word aw in the Quran, afa in mata, mata die, aw alif waw, aw qutil, qutil killed. This word aw is most accurately translated as rather. Yani Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving ishara to the Muslimin within the Quran that this Rasulullah was killed. Rasulullah did not die a natural death. And it is important for us to begin to read Islamic history and to research which of these 2 wives of the Holy Prophet were responsible for poisoning Rasulullah what was the motive of poisoning Rasulullah, and how the poisoning opened the door for their fathers to then take over the Khilafah of Rasulullah, or the Khilafah of Amir al-Mu'mineen. This is an important part of Islamic history that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has outlined within the Quran. أَفَإِن مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلْ. شوفوا انتم the tafsir of the Holy Quran. You look through the hadith of Imam al-Sadiq and the legacy of the literature of Ahlul Bayt when it comes to the Shahada of Rasulullah, because the masdar of all trials and tribulations that fell upon this ummah started from Saqifa. You find this inside of Ziyarat Ashura. Allahumma al'an awwala dhalimin dhalama haqqa Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Awwala dhalimin dhalama haqqa Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The first people to have done dhulm on Ali Muhammad were the people of Saqifa. Hi, Bani Umayyah and Muawiyah and Yazid and Bani Abbas. Sure, what did they do? They didn't do anything more than what the people of Saqifa had done. The people of Saqifa opened the door for them. Sham Ghariban. What did Umar ibn Sa'ad say? Ahrikul khiyam ala man fiha. Before they burned the tents, Umar ibn Sa'ad cried out, Ahrikul khiyam ala man fiha. Burn the tents and burn whoever is inside of the khaymaga. Nafsul kalam that was said in Saqifa. And Ibn Khattab came and stood in front of the door of Sayyidat Nisa al-Alameen. He said, if you don't pay bay'ah and you do not open the door, and if you don't give the bay'ah, we shall burn down the door. They said to him, inside is Hassan and Hussein. He said, wa'in. Even if this dhulm of Karbala, the roots of this dhulm started over there. And it is important for us to understand and to study this and to be able to have enough proof. This is our deen, our identity. Tayyib. If we understand this, you see that the period of Imam Zainul Abidin Ruhillahu al-Fida was very similar to the period of Saqifa. In that the period after the martyrdom and the shahadat, that's why Shabab is very wrong, and it is almost dhulm to say wafat of Rasulullah. It's not wafat. He didn't die a natural death. It is the istishhad of Rasulullah. Shahada of Rasulullah. Ahna, the followers of Rasulullah, if we do not acknowledge that our Nabi was shaheed, what insaf and what justice we expect from outsiders when it comes to Rasulullah? Shahada. For you find that the period after the Shahada of Rasulullah was very similar to the period after the Shahada of Imam al-Hussein and the period of Imam Sajjad Ruhillahu al-Fida. And if you understand this, you also find that when Imam Sajjad Ruhillahu al-Fida returned back to Medina, Bani Umayyah was absolutely staunch in their observations of Imam Sajjad. Imam Sajjad was under strict vigilance, whereby Bani Umayyah had sent a number of spies, including their governor inside of Medina, whose job was to keep a close eye on every movement of Imam Sajjad, such that Bani Umayyah were waiting for an opportunity for Imam Zainul Abidin to say something so they have a reason to execute him and to kill him. If you understand this as the general environment that was prevalent during the time of Imam Sajjad, we now come and we try and we analyze and understand how Imam Sajjad fulfilled the role of imamat. All of this with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. It is narrated and mashhur between the historians that during the time of Bani Umayyah, including the time of Imam Sajjad, Bani Umayyah was involved in a number of cross-border wars where there were these conquests attacks on the territories around the Islamic Empire, where they would go out and they would conquer the lands, just like the way we read within the history of the Crusaders. And this, by the way, again started during the time of Saqifa, where there were military operations and armies that were sent for conquest under the guise of spreading Islam. So they went out and they fought battles, they conquered territories, and they forcefully converted people into Islam. This is a dark period of Islamic history that we have to accept. It is not the history and it is not the Islam of Ali Muhammad. You find that a lot of the animosity that existed even at the coast of Spain when Islam reached Andalus, this was a type of Islam that was forced upon the people, an Islam of bloodshed, and the enmity against Islam was because it was being represented by those other than Ali Muhammad. And hence you find, for damage control, Amirul Mu'mineen would take certain measures like ensuring that Salman becomes the governor in Madain during the government of those who were zalims. Amirul Mu'mineen didn't accept the legitimacy of those who were before him, yet he sent Salman al-Farsi or Salman al-Muhammadi to be the governor of Madain. Why? Damage control. Bring back the people to show what the true teachings of Ali Muhammad represent and reflect. For you find that during this time there were a number of conquests that were happening and cross-border skirmish and fighting. And with this situation, a number of prisoners, it was regular and common practice that prisoners would be taken from these wars, they would be brought back into Medina, and they would be sold as slaves. It is recorded within history that one of the tasks that Imam Sajjad performed is that every year Imam Zainul Abidin purchased hundreds of slaves. Bear with me until we get to the end and you see the natija and you see what Imam Sajjad was able to gain from here. Imam Sajjad on a yearly basis would purchase hundreds of slaves. He would take these slaves under his shelter, under his guidance. And for a period of 1 year, Imam Sajjad would feed them. Imam Sajjad would clothe them. He would give them tarbiyah. He would give them akhlaq. He would give them ilm. Such that after 1 year, the historians mention every year, bidhabt on the night of Eid, Imam Zainul Abidin would then gather all these slaves that he had purchased and these slaves that he had nurtured during the year. This is found inside of, you will find the writings of Sayyid ibn Tawus, where he says Imam Sajjad would gather all the slaves in Shahrul Ramadan, and on the night of Eid, he would liberate all these slaves, and in addition to liberating them, he would give them capital and money to go back into the communities and live a life of dignity. This is recorded within, and this is mashhur within the books of history. Our job over here is ta'ammul and tadabbur, and to analyze the history. So if you understand this is what Imam Sajjad did, let us look at the importance and analyze the depth of the actions of Imam Sajjad. Number one, by Imam Sajjad purchasing slaves, what Imam Zainul Abidin actually did is that he changed the entire social and ethnic makeup of the city of Medina. Because Medina and the Hijazis under the rule of Bani Umayyah were very racist. And an Ajami, a non-Arab that was brought as a slave into Medina, would live as a slave for the rest of his life, such that historians have mentioned slaves would be treated like as if they were animals. They were not even considered to be human beings. You find over here that Imam Sajjad, so within Medina, what was known is that the Ajamis are slaves and they lived as second-class human beings. You find that in this environment, Imam Sajjad every year would purchase 100 slaves from the Ajam. He would not only give them a tarbiyah and nourishment, but he would give them enough money to go back into the community and live a life of dignity, such that the slaves that were freed and liberated by Imam Sajjad now became equals within the community with the other Arabs. They were not under the chains of slavery. Over a period of 35 years, every year, if Imam Sajjad, on the assumption that Imam Sajjad purchased and liberated 100 slaves, that means over a period of 35 years, how many slaves? 3,500 slaves. 3,500 slaves, if each and every one of them got married, makes them how many? 7,000. If these 7,000, all of them, for the sake of example, hypothetically, these 7,000 people had 2 children. How many? 14,000. Within a period of 35 years, Imam Sajjad changed the ethnic makeup of the city of Medina, where the Ajam was equal to the Arab when it came to freedom. From here, we are able to understand that Imam Zainul Abidin used the system of slave trade to abolish slave trade. He fought the system from within. Because some people come with the ishkal and they say, how could Imam Sajjad buy slaves and engage in slave trade, for example? No, we see over here that it was within the wisdom of Imam Sajjad that he used the institution to abolish the institution. This is number one. Number two, you have that, as we said, within the history, that Imam Sajjad would purchase these slaves. And for a period of 1 year, Imam Sajjad turned his house into a madrasa. It was forbidden for Imam Zainul Abidin to preach in Masjidul Nabawi. It was forbidden for Imam Sajjad to give sermons in the public. And therefore, Imam Sajjad resorted to purchasing slaves. And under the roof of his home, and by providing them shelter through his actions, Imam Sajjad nurtured these people with ilm and with akhlaq, such that these slaves, upon being liberated after a year, some of them became fuqaha, some of them became mufassirin of the Quran, some of them became ulama in akhlaq, some of them became ulama in tarikh. They then came out of Medina to spread the message of Ali Muhammad. So what Imam Sajjad did is that he transformed this system of slave trade to produce a generation of Shias and lovers of Ali Muhammad, who were not only staunch in their Aqidah, but who would go out and spread the message of Ali Muhammad. Ya Ali. And it is absolutely important for us to understand and appreciate what Imam Sajjad did, especially when you keep in mind that he was operating and living at a time where there were not even 20 people in the entire Hijaz who had love for Ali Muhammad. And this is why we said at the beginning of the Majlis, Imam Sajjad gave birth to Tashayyu from scratch. From these people who were liberated, to give you an example, and what was the quality of these students who came out from the household of Imam Sajjad, you find that there is a number of research, a number of historians, and even within the Kashiful Ghita Research Institute in Najaf al-Ashraf, you will find that there is enough evidence to indicate that Tashayyu and Shiaism began to spread at a fast rate in the subcontinent during the time of Imam Zainul Abidin. And this was as a result of those slaves and those students that studied under him, men who were liberated. Imam Sajjad sent them to India. And on the other hand, if you were to go back to the writings of Sayyid ibn Tawus, you will find that Sayyid ibn Tawus says on the night of Eid, Imam Sajjad at minimum would liberate 20 slaves. These 20 slaves have become ulama, have become fuqaha over the entire year. Sayyid Ibn Tawus says, and the number of them were of African descent. And from here we are able to understand that Imam Sajjad, those people who were brought into Medina from the conquests of North Africa during the time of Bani Umayyah and were brought as slaves into Medina, Imam Sajjad not only liberated them, turned them into fuqaha, sent them back into Africa, and was the root cause of the spread of Shiaism in Africa. Which is why, if you have a look from the time of Imam Sadiq, Imam al-Kadhim, Imam al-Ridha, Imam al-Jawad, you will find that a number of the pure wives of the Imams actually come from the region of Africa. This was the first mass movement, coordinated movement of spreading tashayyu in Africa by Imam al-Sajjad. Keeping in mind that before Imam Sajjad, by the way, Ja'far al-Tayyar had played a big role in spreading Islam when he was sent to Abyssinia by Rasulullah. From here we are able to understand the mannerism in which Imam Sajjad Ruhillahu al-Fida spread Shiaism and the circumstances in which he spread Shiaism at his time. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. If you understand, this is one. The quality of the people that came out from the madrasa of Imam Sajjad. Do you know one of these slaves that were purchased in this institution of Imam Zainul Abidin is the narrator by the name of Abu Hamza al-Thumali. Abu Hamza al-Thumali, faqih, mutahaddith. From him you learn the dua Abu Hamza al-Thumali that is recited in Shahr Ramadan. This Abu Hamza al-Thumali, how did he end up becoming a companion of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq? Abu Hamza al-Thumali was actually a slave that was purchased by Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. And you look at the natija of the tarbiyah of Imam Sajjad, you have the men, the likes of Abu Hamza. A second person who was a product of the tarbiyah of Imam Sajjad, Abu Khalid al-Kabuli. Abu Khalid al-Kabuli, if you refer back to the books of Rijal al-Kishi or Najashi, you will find the credibility and the status and the praise that is given to Abu Khalid al-Kabuli. And like the way his title mentions, al-Kabuli, he was from present-day Afghanistan. And these were Ajam who had the lowest level of respect within the society. Abu Khalid al-Kabuli was a slave of Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. He then ultimately served Imam Zainul Abidin, and being a servant of Imam al-Sajjad, he became one of those fuqaha and one of those muhaddithin, experts in hadith and the fiqh and spreading the aqidah of Ali Muhammad. He ended up becoming a companion of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. Abu Khalid al-Kabuli was actually responsible and had a great impact on converting Zurara into Shiaism. For those of you who are familiar to a certain extent with Ilm al-Hadith, you know the importance of the likes of Zurara, the companion of the 5th and the 6th Imam. Today, 60% of our fiqh, the hadith that we depend on to extract istinbat through the amaliyat of istinbat by the mujtahideen, 60%, if not 60% of the hadith that we depend on for our fiqh is narrated by the likes of Zurara. Imam Sadiq Ruhi Lahu al-Fida says, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajjal faraja. Had it not been for the likes of Zurara, the knowledge of Ali Muhammad would have been obliterated from this earth. This is Zurara who brought him into the fold of Tashayyu. Abu Khalid al-Kabuli. Abu Khalid al-Kabuli is the product and the natija of the tarbiyah of Imam Sajjad. And from here, Ahibba'i, you are able to understand that Imam Zainul Abidin planted the seeds to grow and to give rise to a generation of companions who would then be the backbone of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. For if the madrasa of Imam al-Baqir and the institution of Imam al-Sadiq was successful, it was because it thrived on the foundation that was created and dug by Imam Sajjad Ruhi Lahul Fida. This on one hand. Number two, the dimensions, the functions of the imamat of Imam Sajjad. Imam Zainul Abidin Ruhi Lahul Fida played a critical role in keeping alive the wilaya of Ali Muhammad and khasatan the wilaya of Amirul Mu'mineen. Shabab, you have to, Ahibba'i, you have to remember that this period that Shiaism went through during the time of Saqifa and during the time of Muawiyah, historians have narrated, and you find the likes of Sunni historians such as Ibn Abul Hadid, who has written a commentary on Nahjul Balagha. Commentary on Nahjul Balagha by Ibn Abul Hadid, by the way, from a historical perspective, is something that can be used to depend upon as a supplementary text. However, depending on the tafsir or the commentary of Ibn Abil Hadid al-Mu'tazili to understand the sermons of Amirul Mu'mineen that speak about Tawheed or Ma'arif is a grave error. And the ulama, contemporary ulama and mujtahideen within the Hawza Ilmiya in Najaf have raised caution in understanding the sermons of Amirul Mu'mineen when it comes to Ma'arif from the commentators, the likes of Ibn Abul Hadid al-Mu'tazili. Why? Because Ibn Abul Hadid was from the Amma. He was actually a Mu'tazili. So when he analyzes and he reads and begins to interpret the sermons of Amirul Mu'mineen, khasatan when it comes to the affairs of Tawheed and the Adala, Ibn Abul Hadid analyzes and does a tafsir of the khutbah based on his Mu'tazilite view of Tawheed. And hence, we as researchers or we as students, lovers of Ali Muhammad who are on the path of seeking knowledge have to be careful such that our Aqidah does not become diluted or corrupted over things like this. Otherwise, the tafsir on its own, la jayyid wahid, depends on it for historical purposes. For you find that within the Sharh of the Nahjul Balagha, Ibn Abil Hadid al-Mu'tazili himself states that during the time of Muawiyah, the environment was so intense and there was so much hatred propagated against the Shias of Amirul Mu'mineen. The dhikr of Amirul Mu'mineen was not tolerated during the reign of Muawiyah, such that if a person was caught or a person was accused of narrating the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen, not only would his house be confiscated, not only would his name be erased from the register of the Baytul Mal. Baytul Mal, if you put between brackets today, what we would say is social services, for example, or a stipend that comes from the government services, that is the right of each and every citizen of the state. Their names would be removed from that register. Their houses would be razed. Ibn Abil Hadid al-Mu'tazili also says that the likes of Ibn Ziyad, these are men who crucified people just based on the tuhma that they were the Shias of Ali. There were those who were not only crucified, فَسَمَّرَ عُيُونَهُمْ, it says, they would nail their eyes together for narrating the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen. This was the hatred that was exposed, that was portrayed against Amir. A person who was Shia of Amir al-Mu'mineen could not dare say the name Ali in public. Leave aside the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And as you saw a couple of nights back, one of the greatest motives of the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad and Yazid, the men that rallied together on the day of Ashura to wage war against Sayyid al-Shuhada, one of the motives is that they were fueled with the hatred of Amirul Mu'mineen. And hence you find that Imam Sajjad, within this environment of hate, upheld the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen and propagated the wilayah of Amirul Mu'mineen. You find that an example of this is when Imam Sajjad reached the land of Sham as a prisoner. And you can imagine, Imam Sajjad has come into the city of Sham together with his women and his children. They are bound by ropes and they are bound by chains. They are a minority of about 60 to 100 people brought in as prisoners. The entire Sham, the Maqatil mention that when Ahlul Bayt reached Sham, they were made to wait outside Bab Tuma. Bab Tuma is one of the 7 or 10 entrances into Dimishq. Sham, by the way, when you read in history, Sham at that time was constituting of present day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan and Palestine. These 4 present day countries collectively were known as Sham. And the capital of Sham was Damascus. And within the capital Damascus, the presidential palace, you could say, was this Masjidul Amawi. The Darbar Yazid, for those of you, or Darbar Sham, Darbar Yazid, those of you who have had the opportunity to visit Sayyidah Ruqayya or Sayyidah Sakina and Sayyidah Zainab, masjid which is known. For Imam al-Sajjad, together with the women, have been brought over here. 3 days. They have been made to wait in Babu Saghir. Babu Saghir is the well-known cemetery. They were made to wait there for 3 days, whilst the city of Dimishq is being decorated and the public holiday has been announced. Imam al-Sajjad says that we were paraded through the bazaar in Sham. The heads of our father and the heads of the shuhada are on the spear. The people are beating drums. The people are laughing at us. The people are jeering at us. There are people who are throwing stones on us. If there is an environment where a person could feel intimidated in the highest sense, in the purest sense of the meaning, to be intimidated. Not only are you a minority, but you are surrounded by enemies of the most vicious type. In this circumstance, Imam Zainul Abidin is standing in the Darbar in Sham. Yazid says, it is mentioned in the Maqtal, Yazid says to one of his khatibs, to one of the speakers over there, praise Muawiyah, and I want you to insult Hussein and his family. The Maqtal says, فَسَعَدَ الْخَتِيبُ مِنْبَرًا وَمَدَحَ مُعَاوِيَةَ وَبَالَغَ فِيهِ وَقَدْ أَبْلَغَ بِالْوَكِيعَةِ فِي عَلِيٍّ وَحُسَيْنَ. Al-Waqi'ah, he went over and above to insult Imam al-Hussein and to insult Amirul Mu'mineen from the mimbar. And at that point, in these circumstances, Imam Sajjad, the Maqtal says, فَصَاحَ بِهِ or صَاحَ إِلَيْهِ السَّجَّاد Ali ibn al-Hussein, فَصَاحَ إِلَيْهِ Ali ibn al-Hussein وَقَالَ لَهُ وَيْلَكَ, woe be upon you. اشتريت رضا المخلوق بسخط الخالق. You've purchased the pleasure of this creation at the expense of the anger of your Lord. تبوأ مقعدك في النار. Confirm your place in Jahannam. publicly they began to insult Amir al-Mu'mineen. And you know that Amir al-Mu'mineen was cursed from the mimbars across the Islamic lands for close to 60 years. But my point is the circumstance in which Imam Sajjad stood up and began to protect and began to convey and narrate the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Do you know, in these circumstances, as soon as Amir al-Mu'mineen, as soon as Imam al-Sajjad rebuked this khatib, he stood on the mimbar, and this is where Imam Sajjad began to give his khutbah. And perhaps many of you are familiar with this khutbah, but there's a particular point that I want to make from this khutbah. Imam Sajjad stands up on the mimbar after having rebuked them for insulting Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he begins to introduce himself by introducing and reciting the fada'il of Rasulullah. And he goes on to say, Ana ibn Makkah wa Mina, Ana ibn Zamzam wa Safa, Ana ibn man hamal al-rukn bi atraf al-rida, Ana ibn man humila bil buraq fil hawa, أنا ابن من صلى به ملائكة السماء صفا صفا أنا ابن من بلغ به جبرائيل إلى سدرة المنتهى أنا ابن من دنا فتدلى فكان قاب قوسين أو أدنى أنا ابن من أوحى إليه الجليل ما أوحى أنا ابن محمد المصطفى Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Imam Sajjad says, standing in the darbar, minority in chains against all these enemies, he says, I am the son of Rasulullah, I am the son of Zamzam and Safa, I am the son of Makkah and Mina. These are all characters and qualities of Rasulullah. He says, I am the son of that person who carried the Hajar al-Aswad in his rida and put it back to the Kaaba. I am the son of that Rasulullah who was raised by Jibreel on the Buraq on the night of Mi'raj. I am that son of Rasulullah who the Malaika recited salat behind him line after line. I am the son of that Rasulullah who was taken up to Sidratul Muntaha by Jibreel. I am that son of that prophet who reached the highest point of existence. I am that son of that Rasul who Allah conversed with him a secret that no one else knows. I am the son of Rasulullah. And then he comes and he introduces himself as the grandson of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And this is the Shahid Ahibai. Amir Imam Sajjad Ruhi Lahul Fida in a majlis that is filled with the enemies of Amir al-Mu'mineen. In a majlis that has been fueled by hatred of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Have nothing but bughd of Amir inside of him. Imam Sajjad proudly stands while despite being in chains. He comes and he describes Amir al-Mu'mineen and he says, Ana ibn Ali al-Murtada, Ana ibn man qatala bayna yaday Rasulillahi bisayfayn, wa daraba, Ana ibn man daraba bayna yaday Rasulillahi bisayfayn, wa ta'ana birumhayn, wa qatala ببدر وحنين ولم يكفر بالله طرفة عين. I am the son of that Ali ibn Abi Talib that fought in the hands or in front of Rasulullah, defending Rasulullah with two swords. I am the son of that Ali that fought in the war with two spears. I am the son of that Ali that killed the kuffar in Badr and Hunayn. I am the son of that Ali who didn't perform kufr for the blink of an eye. Ana ibn Ali al-Murtada. In a majlis, in an atmosphere that is filled with nasibis and haters of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Sajjad stood up and recited the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Refer back to the khutbah of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He goes on and he describes Amir al-Mu'mineen, Allahu Akbar, the fada'il, ma'rifah of Amir al-Mu'mineen through the khutbah of Imam Sajjad. Describes Amir al-Mu'mineen. In what way he describes him? Laythun Hijaz wa Kabshul Iraq, Makkiyun Madani, Khayfiyun Abaki, Muhajiriyun Shajari, بدري أحدي وارث المعشرين أبو السبتين الحسن والحسين علي بن أبي طالب. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجه. Over here, it's a couple of things. Imam Zainul Abidin, in the capital of the Nawasib, in the capital of the Nawasib, in a state of imprisonment, bound by ropes, in the most courageous manner, upheld the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen and propagated the wilayah of Amirul Mu'mineen. I buy this is a lesson for us. I don't mean to be rude towards anyone. This is not directed at any one person, but as a general observation. And you travel the world, be it in North America, be it in Europe, be it in Africa, Shia communities, there is a movement to belittle and de-signify the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen. You come and you find that, unfortunately, people who portray themselves as scholars, they come and they make a mockery of the majalis of the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen. You see, what is portrayed outside, these are wahwa majalis. Wahwa majalis, people gave their lives to make sure that the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen reached us from generation to generation. You have people who organize majalis and committee members who organize majalis, and they will come and say, Shaykhna, do you recite whatever you want from the member? Just these majalis of fada'il, we don't want from them. Allahu Akbar. Is there a deen other than, which type of deen is Islam if it doesn't have the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen? And yet you find within the English world there is a constant belittling and a mockery of the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen. To the extent that over a period of years, even accepting and acknowledging the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen is becoming problematic. Shias living a life where their aqidah is diluted, and in their eyes, Amirul Mu'mineen or Ali ibn Abi Talib is nothing more than any other normal human being. Just, he was the companion of Rasulullah and he had some good etiquettes or good qualities here and there. If we do not keep up the fada'il and the legacy of Amirul Mu'mineen, if we do not recount the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen, who are we expecting to come and pass this on to the next generation? A qasaman on the member of Imam al-Hussein, and I say this almost every year on the shahadat of Imam al-Sajjad. The key to the problems that we face in the 21st century, the key to remaining safe from a number of the issues that we face is the wilayah and the fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen. This fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen has an impact on the heart. A person who carries the love of Amirul Mu'mineen is not going to get easily influenced by the fasad and the fitna and the fisk and the lack of morality that exists in the outside world. In the Hawza, we hear this inside of the Hawza. What elders in the Hawza say. It was once a couple of months back, a person came, Zawar from the West. He came to one of the Mujtahideen and they were talking to them about the issues that we face inside of the West. And he says to the Marja, he says to the Mujtahid, Sayyid, we're scared. I'm scared for my son. Maybe tomorrow he wakes up and he decides he wants to be a different gender. He says, I'll die. Mujtahid said to him, instill inside your son the love of Amirul Mu'mineen. He fortifies us in ways that we cannot even comprehend. It's two greatest institutions that we have, Fada'il of Amirul Mu'mineen and the Azadari of Ahlul Bayt. How shameful is it that both these institutions are under attack by so-called Shia. The two greatest institutions that keep us alive. The institution which generation after generation Shias have given their blood to ensure that it reaches us. Today we ourselves are the Aslan, we don't even need the Nawasib. And if we were going to take lessons from the life of Imam al-Sajjad, انتم شوفوا, return back, the khutbah of Imam al-Sajjad is also translated. Refer back to the khutbah of Imam al-Sajjad and count the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen. There are at least 50 fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen that Imam al-Sajjad recounted and narrated in the Darbar of Sham. And what was the tactic of Yazid? When he saw that they are going to get exposed and the people are lending a ear to Imam al-Sajjad, he came and he forced the muaddin to give the adhan and disrupt the khutbah of Imam al-Sajjad. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. There is much to say in regards to what Amir al-Mu'mineen or what Imam al-Sajjad did to uphold the wilaya and the dhikr of Amir al-Mu'mineen and to spread the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Perhaps on a different occasion we have an opportunity to continue. Masa'ib ahibba'i. Imam al-Sajjad wept his entire life over the tragedy of Karbala. The narrations mention, historians mention, that on a regular basis Imam Sajjad would go into the souk, into the bazaar. And he would go and particularly he would stand at that part of the bazaar where the sheep and the animals were being sacrificed. The butchers, where the meat and the chickens and the cows, the dhabiha has been done. Imam al-Sajjad would purposely go and stand over there. And it is narrated that when the butcher would come to slaughter the cow or to slaughter the sheep, or slaughter the chicken, Imam al-Sajjad would say to the butcher, stop, stop. He says, what, Yabna Rasulullah? He says, did you feed this animal with water? Did you quench the thirst of this animal? They said to him, Yabna Rasulullah, Zayn al-Abidin, we are Muslims. Allah, Allah. We are Muslims, we do not sacrifice and we do not slaughter these animals except that we have quenched their thirst. Imam al-Sajjad would turn towards Masjid al-Nabawi and he would cry out and he would say, "Wa madluma, the animals are being fed water, and over here the grandson of Rasulullah was slaughtered while he was thirsty." Imam al-Sajjad lived with this grief. But do you know what hurt Imam al-Sajjad the most? Was the tragedy of Sham. Allah. Until the end of his life, Imam al-Sajjad would say, Asham, Asham. The manner in which they were paraded in the bazaar. Imam al-Sajjad says, not only did they laugh on us, not only did these evil men look at our women, it says these people threw stones on us while we were in the bazaar. The narrations mention that Imam Zainul Abidin was poisoned on a night like this by Walid al-La'in. He was poisoned in the insides of the Imam due to the intensity of the poison. The insides of Imam Zainul Abidin were like as if they are on fire. And it was on a night like this that Imam Zainul Abidin became shaheed and the Imam al-Baqir began to give Imam Sajjad ghusl. Today I want to speak to you of how Imam al-Baqir gave Imam Zainul Abidin ghusl and what happened when Imam al-Baqir was giving ghusl. The alim says, when Imam al-Baqir was giving ghusl to Imam Zainul Abidin, he says, do not ask Imam al-Baqir, do not ask Imam al-Baqir about the wounds and the scars on the body of Zainul Abidin. Imam al-Baqir says, when I was giving ghusl to my father, I saw that there are two types of bruises and two types of wounds on the back of my father Zainul Abidin. They asked him, Ya Ya Imam al-Baqir, what bruises? He says the first bruise was because of the heavy sacks of rice and food that the Imam Sajjad would carry on his back and deliver to the food and to the households of the people of Medina. His entire life he was carrying sacks of rice. These bruises remained on his back. So they said to Imam al-Baqir, and what about the second type? Imam al-Baqir says the second type of bruises on the back of my father Zainul Abidin are the bruises that he received when he was whipped by the army of Shimr when they walked from Karbala to Kufa and Kufa to Sham. Imam Zainul Abidin says in this entire journey, whenever they put the spear of Imam al-Hussein, whenever they put the head of Imam al-Hussein on a spear, if any one of the women or the children cried, Imam Zainul Abidin says, Shimr would come and he would whip us on our he would come and he would whip us on our backs. If the women cried, they would hit us on the head with spears. Do not ask me how Imam Zainul Abidin was whipped, but for 33 years, those wounds remained on the back of Imam Sajjad. Allah. But Imam al-Baqir says, in addition to the wounds on the back of my father, Imam Zainul Abidin, he says, when we were giving a ghusl to my father, Zainul Abidin, I saw that there were cuts and there were scars on the wrists of my father, Sajjad. They asked him, where did these cuts come from? Imam al-Baqir says, they came from the manner in which my father was tied with ropes and chains while he was prisoner. Allah, Shiat ala Muhammad. Do you know, in the Maqtal it is mentioned when Imam al-Sajjad was taken from Kufa to Sham, Imam al-Sajjad was so weak due to his illness that every time he was on the camel would be running every now and then. Imam al-Sajjad, because of his weakness, he couldn't even sit on the camel. He couldn't even sit on the camel. Imam Zainul Abidin would fall off the camel. So they had to stop the camel. They lift Sajjad and they put him back on the camel. So Shimr came to Umar ibn Sa'ad and he said to him, Sajjad Ali ibn al-Hussein keeps falling off the camel. If we stop the camels every now and then, we will never reach Sham. And our gifts and our rewards from Yazid are going to be delayed. So Umar ibn Sa'ad said, then what should we do? The Maqtal mentions Shimr said, tie Sajjad to the stomach of a camel. So if he falls down from the camel, let the camel drag Sajjad through the desert. Allah, do not ask me of what Imam al-Baqir saw when he gave ghusl to his father Zainul Abidin. From all the wounds and all the scars that were on the body of Imam Zainul Abidin, Imam al-Baqir says, when we were giving ghusl to our father Zainul Abidin, there were marks on his body, and these were the marks of burns on the body of Imam Sajjad. They said to him, burn marks on the body of Sajjad. Imam al-Baqir says, these are the marks of his skin being burnt from Sham-e Ghariban. On the night after Ashura, when Umar ibn Sa'ad said, burn the tents of the Kharijis, Imam al-Baqir says, my father was so ill, he was not able to come out of the Khaymaga. Hamid ibn Muslim says, I saw Zainab, the daughter of Ali. Sometimes she would run into the Khaymaga. She would run out of the Khaymaga. She did this a number of times. He says, I thought there is something important or something expensive in the Khayma. I went a little bit closer. I see Zainab is trying to remove Ali Sajjad from the Khayma. And in the process, Imam Sajjad's body got burnt. Allah, final part of the Masaib, Shi'at Ali Muhammad. The Maqtal mentions that it is on a night like this that Imam Zainul Abidin became Shaheed. So he laid down, Imam al-Baqir laid Imam Sajjad down on the ground facing towards the Qibla. Imam Zainul Abidin gave the final wasiyah to Imam al-Baqir. He said to him, you are the Imam and the Hujjah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after me. Imam Zainul Abidin then then gave Imam al-Baqir the Mus'haf Fatima. He then gave him the Quran of Imam Ali. He then gave him the Dhul Fiqar. Imam al-Sajjad then gave Imam al-Baqir the Aqiq. And then he gave him the Ismul A'adham. Imam Zainul Abidin, the sweat of death began to drip down the forehead of Imam Zainul Abidin. Allah, Allah, ya Shia. These are the final moments of Imam Zainul Abidin. As he was taking his final breaths, Imam al-Baqir says, I put my head on the chest of my father, Imam Sajjad. When Imam Zainul Abidin saw this, he opened his eyes and Imam Zainul Abidin began crying uncontrollably. Imam al-Baqir raised his head. He said, oh father, why are you weeping? Allah, ya Shia, final part of the Masa'ib. Imam Sajjad began to weep uncontrollably. He said to him, my son Muhammad, in my final moments, I am blessed that I have the head of my son on my chest. Do you know who was on the chest of my father during his final moments? There was Shimr who came. He kicked Imam al-Hussein on the chest. Imam al-Hussein is looking to the Khaybar shouting, Zainab, go back. Matam Hussein, Matam Sajjad, Ya Hussein.
बीमार शाम का बाजार आबिद 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 बीमार या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन रुकता नहीं आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून 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 रुकता नहीं जिसको ज़ैनब के लिए जिसको ज़ैनब के लिए पर्दा कहीं मिलता नहीं आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं देखो ना मेरा तमाशा रोके आबिद ने कहा साथ मेरे आई है होके वो कैदी बेरदा संग नंगे सर जिसको कभी, नंगे सर जिसको कभी बाबा ने भी देखा नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। देखो ना मेरा तमाशा, रोके आबिद ने कहा, साथ मेरे आई है होके वो कैदी बेरिदा। नंगे सर जिसको कभी, नंगे सर जिसको कभी बाबा ने भी देखा नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। गम न करना तू सकीना, सफ्र में ज़ैनब के साथ, सीने में सो जा नमा के जब भी हो जाएगी रात, लौट कर आएगा अब, लौट कर आएगा अब, बेटी तेरा बाबा नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। हम न करना तू सकीना, सफ में ज़ैनब के साथ, सीने पे सो जा नमा के जब भी हो जाएगी रात, लौट कर आएगा अब, लौट कर आएगा अब, बेटी तेरा बाबा नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। जिसको ज़ैनब के लिए, जिसको ज़ैनब के लिए पर्दा कहीं मिलता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। डर से सहमी है सकीना, खून कानों से रवा, पूछती दिखला के आबिद को तमाचों के निशान, कब वतन में जाएंगे, कब वतन में जाएंगे, कोई यहाँ अपना नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। डर से सहमी है सकीना, खून कानों से रवा, पूछती दिखला के आबिद को तमाचों के निशान, कब वतन में जाएंगे, कब वतन में जाएंगे, कोई यहाँ अपना नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। जिसको ज़ैनब के लिए, जिसको ज़ैनब के लिए पर्दा कहीं मिलता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं, आबिदे बीमार की आंखों से खून रुकता नहीं। या हुसैन, या हुसैन, या हुसैन, या हुसैन, या हुसैन, या हुसैन, या हुसैन।
मुतवज्जे ज़्यादा। अस्सलामु अलैका या अबा अब्दुल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या इब्न रसूल अल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका व अला जद्दिका व अबीक, अस्सलामु अलैका व अला उम्मिका व अखीक, अस्सलामु अलैका व अला अल-अइम्मति मिन बनीक, अस्सलामु अलैका या साहिब दमअति साकिबा, अस्सलामु अलैका या साहिबल मुसीबत अर्रातिबा, लक़द अस्बह किताब अल्लाह फ़ीका महजूरा व रसूलुल्लाह फ़ीका मौतूरा। अस्सलामु अलैकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। अस्सलामु अलैका या गरीबल गुरबा।